Hey, Farmers Branch family. It's time for Bible study from the Big Comfy Chair. And we've been in the 11th chapter of Zechariah for a couple of weeks now. We've seen what Jeremiah's prophecy has in common with Zechariah's prophecy. And we have seen what the 13th chapter and 14th chapters of Revelation, how they correspond to the events of Zechariah's prophecy. And how that Jesus foretells that worthless shepherd that Zechariah speaks of when another comes in his own name, and him they follow. And then Revelation 13 tells us the story of the beast from the sea and his false prophet, the beast from the land, being the land of Israel. And tonight, Zechariah's prophecy is amazing, but so is Daniel's prophecy. And it's really vital to a good understanding of the end times to understand what Daniel is and is not talking about. And Daniel talks about this beast of the 13th chapter as well. So, let's go to Daniel. Now, oftentimes people misunderstand and misapply this particular prophecy of Daniel. And they make it into things it's not, mainly because we and they are largely ignorant about the events that surrounded the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the fall of Jerusalem and these end times that Daniel speaks of. He speaks of the end of the 70 weeks of years allotted to his people. That is the end time to which Daniel speaks. You remember, all of prophecy is fulfilled in the coming of Jesus and the judgment of those who reject him, until we get to the New Testament. Then we learn about what's ahead of us, perhaps. And we'll study that in a future study of Revelation. But tonight, the fascinating and specific prophecy and how the 7th chapter of Daniel and the 13th chapter of Revelation and the 11th chapter of Zechariah are inextricably linked with the words of Jesus. If another comes in his own name, him you will follow. Tragic story, but one that's very specifically prophesied here. So we're going to see what the four beasts in Daniel 7 have to do with the beast from the sea in Revelation 13. So, again, I'm reading from Daniel in the translation of the Hebrew Scripture, called the Septuagint, which has some decided advantage over reading the work product of the Masoretes, the Masoretic text. And I'll read from the English translation of the Septuagint. And again, as usual, I'm going to take the liberty of translating a few of the words a little bit differently. Especially here. Now, this portion of Daniel, the extant copies, the existing copies that we have, this portion of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic. So some of the words are a little bit different from the Hebrew words, but they correspond really well to the Hebrew words. And where I think the translators miss the point and the context of what Daniel's describing, it may be different than what's in your Bibles, and it will be different than a few of the words in this Syriac or Chaldean or Aramaic text. Now, one of those I'll go ahead and clue you on is the word that's translated earth or world. World is absolutely a bad translation. It doesn't mean the whole world. It may mean the entirety of the landmass of the earth, but almost never is it used in that context. In Hebrew, the word is eretz. In Greek, the word is geos. And those words are words that are most commonly used to describe a land, like as in the land of Israel. And since this is the peoples that are concerned with Daniel's prophecy, we should translate it the land, as in the land of Israel, not the world or the earth. Some people confuse this passage of Scripture in the 7th chapter of Daniel as speaking to our end time. But Daniel doesn't speak to our end time. He speaks to the end time of his people, which came to an abrupt and terrible end in 135 AD under the leadership of the worthless shepherd and Antichrist, Bar Kokhba, or now known as Ben Kosaba. Son of the star, well, we know he's the son of the light. So, let's read. During the first year of Belshazzar's reign over the land of Babylonia, Daniel saw a vision from his head upon his bed. Then Daniel wrote down the vision that he saw. He wrote as a summary of the account. On my bed I was watching in my sleep during the night, and lo, the four winds of heaven fell upon a great sea, and four beasts were coming up out of the sea, each one differing from the other. The first was like a lioness, having as though wings of an eagle. I kept watching until its wings were plucked out, and it was lifted from the ground and was set upon human feet. And a human heart was given to it. And lo, and let's note here that this beast has one head. And lo, another beast was after it, having the likeness of a bear, and it was higher or larger on one side, and the three ribs were in its mouth. And thus it said, Rise, devour much flesh. And after this I was watching, and note, this beast had one head. But after this I was watching in a vision by night, Rise, devour much flesh. And after this I was watching another beast like a leopard, and four wings of a bird were on it, and the beast had four heads. One head, four heads, 6 heads. And language was given to it. But after this I was watching in a vision by night a terrifying fourth beast, and the fear of it was surpassing in strength. And it had great iron teeth, devouring and pounding. It was trampling with its feet round about, and it behaved differently from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. So now we have 4 beasts with 7 heads between them, and 10 horns. And many designs were in its horns, and there were horns of different types. And lo, one horn grew up among them, an 11th horn grows up among them. And many designs were among its horns, and 3 of the earlier horns were removed by it. And lo, eyes like human eyes were in this horn, and a mouth speaking great things, and it made war against the holy ones. So here we see the emergence. Now, each of these beasts, as we'll find out, describe nations that had held Judah captive. And they're used as a metaphor to describe what Judah had become under the influence of these nations. The influence of their captivities had not been good for them. They had tended to take on the nature of those captors. And so here we see the emergence within the land of Israel, within the land of Judah, within Judea, a leader that comes up who's still under that influence of the Roman captivity, because we'll find out who these nations are and why they represent Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and how this horn that comes up represents a leader in the land of Judah that is born of the influences, and we'll find out the influences of all those nations that had held Judah captive. So the 9th verse, I kept watching until thrones were set, and an ancient of days sat, having a cloak like snow, and the tuft of hair on his head was like pure wool. The throne was like a flame of fire shooting out, and a stream of fire went out from before him. 1,000 thousands were waiting on him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him, and books were opened, and a court sat in judgment. So here is the judgment for the rejection of the Messiah, a final judgment, a desolation brought about by the idolatry of the nation, an abomination of desolation. And the desolation is about to occur. I was then watching the noise of the great words which the horn kept speaking, and the beast was beaten to death. The fourth beast is beaten to death. And its body perished and was given over to burning with fire. Now we have the four beasts. The first three have 6 heads between them. 6 heads between them. And the final one had 1 head, and that beast is beaten and receives a mortal wound. So in 13th chapter, when we see a beast with 7 heads, one of which has a deadly wound, it's because the fourth beast of the 4 that constitute the influences that created this beast from the sea in Revelation will have had its head crushed, but will have recovered in the person of the beast in Revelation. And he removed those around him from their authority. So here's the little horn who removes those around him, Judea, from Roman authority. This is called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. This is a very important period in Jewish history. It's a short period. How short? Well, let's let Daniel, a long time before, tell us, and then we'll confirm it historically. And he removed those around him from their authority, and the time of life was granted to them for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and lo, as it were, a son of man, we know it to be the Son of Man, was coming upon the clouds of heaven. Now, whenever you see a deity in the ancient Near East coming in the clouds of heaven, he's coming in judgment. Now, Jerusalem has already been judged and the temple destroyed. Now, the land is about to experience a desolation. And he came as far as the Ancient of Days, and the attendants were present with him. And royal authority was given to him and all the nations of the earth according to posterity, and all honor was serving him. Speaking of Christ. And his authority is an everlasting authority which shall never be removed, and his kingship which shall never perish. And as for me, Daniel, so here we have, before we go on, here we have the nation of Judah under the influence of the 4 nations that had held it captive: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And out of those influences springs a leader that rules the land, that springs up, and he rules those immediate to him, and he takes them from the grip of Rome for a little while. How long? We're going to find out. And as for me, Daniel, since I was exhausted by these things, by the night vision, I approached one of those standing and was seeking the truth from him about all these things. So answering, he spoke to me and disclosed to me the meaning of the words. These great beasts are 4 kingdoms which shall perish from the earth, and holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. So these 4 kingdoms are going to disappear, but the kingdom of the Son of Man will be forever and ever. 19. Then I wanted to learn accurately concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and extremely terrible. And lo, its teeth were iron, and its claws were bronze, consuming all around about and trampling with the feet. And concerning its 10 horns that were upon its head, and the one which was growing, and 3 fell out because of it. And that horn had eyes and a mouth speaking great things, and its looks surpassed the others. You remember Bar Kokhba, great and boastful words, and even to blasphemy and claims of messiahship. Clearly, the Antichrist is being described here. And I was observing that horn preparing for war against the holy ones and routing them until the Ancient of Days came. Bar Kokhba, like I said, persecuted and pursued the Christians far more aggressively, cruelly, and creatively than Nero or any other Roman emperor ever thought about doing. The holy ones spoken of here is the body of Christ, and they will be celebrated in the 14th chapter of Revelation as the 144,000 that followed the Lamb wherever he goes. Until the Ancient of Days came, and he gave the verdict for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time was given, and the holy ones gained possession of the seat of empire. Remember, the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God and his Christ. And we're told that for 1,000 years we'll reign with him on earth. 23. And it was said to me concerning the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall excel over the whole earth, and disturb it, and grind it down. As for the 10 horns of the kingdom, 10 kings shall rise, and another king shall arise after these, and he shall excel more than the former ones in evil. And he shall humble 3 kings. Bar Kokhba. And he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear down the holy ones of the Most High, and shall expect to change seasons and law. And everything shall be delivered into his hands for how long? For a time and times, until half a time, for 3.5 years. John, in his Revelation, says it as 42 months, and we'll see that when we read it. So these beasts there's a great deal of concordance here between the little horn and the grotesque chimera that emerges from the sea of chaos in the 13th chapter of Revelation. It's good to do a side-by-side comparison of this when you review this, if you review this. I hope you do. This is really fascinating. And everything shall be delivered into his hands for a time, times, until half a time. And the trials shall sit, and they shall destroy authority, and they shall resolve to defile and destroy completely. This is the Antichrist that results in the complete destruction of Judah. And it's prophesied by Daniel. And it's within the limits of his prophecy. It's amazing prophecy. And he shall give the authority and the kingdom and the magnitude of all the kingdoms which are under heaven to the people of the Most High. So the kingdom will be taken from Bar Kokhba and from those who rejected their Savior, and will be given to the children of the Most High, those who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And shall give the authority and the kingdom and the magnitude of all the kingdoms which are under heaven to the holy people of the Most High, to reign over an everlasting kingdom. And all authorities will be subjected to him, to Christ, what we call the millennium reign, will be subjected to him and obey him until the conclusion of the word. As for me, Daniel, I was seized with a great dismay, and my condition spread within me, and I fixed the matter in my heart. This is not a good word to the prophet Daniel. He'll be told that 70 weeks of years will be allotted to his people, and then the end will come. Here, Daniel's given a vision of that end and the person who will lead them into that desolation because of their idolatry. Boy, an amazing prophecy. So let's go now to the 13th chapter of Revelation finally. And we've heard what words it has in common with the prophet Jeremiah. We'll point them out as we read. We know what is in common now with the prophecy of Zechariah. And tonight we have read what it has in common in content with the prophecy of Daniel, because they're alluding to all the same thing. And it makes no mistake that this is a Jewish Antichrist involved in the end of time allotted for the Jewish nation in the prophecy of Daniel. This is the end time. It is the end time to which Jesus refers in Matthew 24. We're facing yet another end time, and the Revelation has something to say to that. But all the Old Testament prophecy is sealed up in the coming rejection of Jesus Christ and the judgment on those who fail to accept and embrace their Savior. Well, let's go to the Revelation. It'll take me just a little bit to get there. Now, to set up this 13th chapter, we have to understand the content of the 12th chapter. So let's go there first. And here we see the appearance of two great signs in heaven. Both of these turn out to have been historically verifiable, actual astronomical events that tell the story that we're about to tell here in Hebrew astrology. And by astrology, I don't mean telling the future. I mean portraying the events of the future, but not guiding your day-to-day life. But apparently the gospel of Christ was written in the heavens. The heavens declare the glory of God. And so we'll hear this, and what this is, and I'll give you a little interpretation to head into it. And it's very important because it describes a great red dragon, which we find out is Satan or the devil. And it's describing the events of the incarnation of Christ, the first great sign. The second great sign is the rebellion in heaven that Jesus describes in Matthew when he says that from John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. So here we read the story of what Jesus was talking about. And what Jesus was talking about when he said, in grammar that assures it was a literal event that he witnessed, "Behold, I saw Satan fall from heaven as lightning." And this is, in apocalyptic terms, description of the events of the incarnation, the ascension, the persecution of the church, and the rebellion in heaven, where Satan takes a third with him. And all these things are described here. And I believe those events were contemporary with Jesus' walk on earth. So here, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. We're going to see this a couple more times in Revelation, aren't we? These beasts in the 13th and 17th chapter begin to more and more resemble the dragon. Now, this sign in heaven with the woman with the crown of 12 stars on her head and the moon at her feet, clothed in the sun, that was an actual astronomical event on September 11th, 3 BC. A very plausible time for the conception of Jesus Christ. We have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. So another sign appears in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Remember the head of the 4th beast in Daniel 7? What did it have on its heads? It has 10 crowns. 10 horns, rather. 10 horns, and we'll see that it gains 7 crowns. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Gives birth to Jesus here in the 12th chapter of Revelation. And the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But the dragon was not strong enough. And they lost their place in heaven, and the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah." That kingdom given forever to the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven and to those who follow him, spoken of in Daniel 7. So we're talking about the time of Daniel's prophecy in that chapter 7. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuse them before our God day and night has been hurled down. If you remember a previous lesson, that we have no accuser in heaven anymore. We only have an advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous. The accuser of the brethren has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows his time is short. It's even shorter today than when John wrote this. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. The diaspora of the children of the woman who is righteous Israel. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Now that's the setup for the 13th chapter. And there are no chapter divisions in John's vision. So immediately it goes, and the dragon, that great red dragon that swept with its tail a third of the stars of the heavens, that dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns, and on each had a blasphemous name. Here is the birth of the hideous chimera. It's the birth of the beast in the embryonic image of the dragon. And we'll see in chapter 17, it grows into the very image of the dragon. Here it emerges from the sea, though. It's a clumsy chimera. It's a conjoinment of the features of all 4 of the beasts mentioned in the 7th chapter of Daniel, and contains 7 heads. And of course, those 4 beasts had 7 heads between them. It said, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like a bear and a mouth like a lion. Remember, it had a lion, bear, and a leopard. Now, the 4th beast, as Rome, we know it's Rome because 2nd Esdras, the vision of Ezra in 2nd Esdras identifies specifically the 4th beast of Daniel as being Rome. And of course that fits very well historically to the history of the story. And the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. And one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound. Now, what head was that? That was the 4th beast's head. Remember, the 4th beast was beaten to death and his body burned. That had seen its demise, but it's back. And it says, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? And you remember in our reading last week that the Emperor Hadrian, Rome had essentially been defeated. This was a bad time for the Roman Empire. Their recruitment push lasted for 40 more years because of the decimation of the Roman legions at the hands of Bar Kokhba. They had overcome them, and Hadrian, remember last week, said that if his God had not defeated him, he could not have been defeated, unless his rock had sold him, from the Song of Moses in the 32nd chapter of Deuteronomy. Oh, I also found a mistake looking at myself last week. Balaam's prophecy about there shall arise a star out of Jacob is in the book of Numbers, not Deuteronomy. I know better than that, but sometimes having to think and talk at the same time are hard. Hard for me anyway. All right, and so, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? And the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. Remember the little horn in Daniel 7? Cut out of the same cloth here. They're the same person. And it opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. Remember Bar Kokhba's prayer before going into battle? God, we don't need your help. Just don't help our enemies. Blasphemy. And to call himself the Messiah. Blasphemy. And it was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. Remember, that's the activity of the little horn in Daniel 7. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation, all the inhabitants of the land, as in the land of Israel, land of Judah, will worship the beast, all those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And what follows is those words from Jeremiah 15, where God says, if Moses and Samuel both were standing before me, my heart would not go out to these people. Tell them to go. And they ask, where shall we go? And some of the words from Jeremiah are here. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, they'll be killed. Now go. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. And certainly that was a terrible trial of persecution for the early church. Many were terribly tortured and cruelly killed for not showing allegiance to this beast. But there's a second beast. And I think it's important to understand that this portion, this 13th chapter of Revelation is talking about this period of time that is the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the end time prophesied by Daniel. Because what we see here is a second beast. Now the first beast is personified in the person of Bar Kokhba, but it's abstracted in secular Zionism. It's secular Zionism that lusts for the land but rejects the God of the land. And we will see a resurgence of that secular Zionist influence in the 17th chapter as the beast grows up when we study Revelation again, and we're going to hear some of it on Sunday morning through the able ministry of our pastor. But let's talk about the second beast, because it's a very important concept to understand about this 13th chapter, and is part of the story of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. One of what is often referred to as the first and greatest rabbi, Kabbalistic rabbi of rabbinical Judaism, was a 1st and 2nd century fellow by the name of Rabbi Akiva. Now, it's Rabbi Akiva that declared Bar Kokhba to be the star out of Jacob, to be the Messiah, and took and stood him in the holy place as Daniel would prophesy, an abomination that would bring about the desolation of the land. Stood him in the place of the holy temple and anointed him with oil and declared him to be the Messiah of Israel. An idolatry that could not be abided. It had been foretold by Zechariah, by Daniel, by Jesus. Another who comes in his own name. And it was a play on his own name. Having been born by a similar name, the rabbi took a play on that name and made it into son of a star. Now the Christians called him Ben Kozeva, and that's a name that the later rabbis, and the rabbis refer to him now in the Talmud as Bar Kozeba. I'm Ben Kozeba. Bar means son of, Ben means son of in Aramaic. Son of a lie. He wasn't the Messiah. He's a false Messiah. He's an Antichrist. And the play on his name, and we're going to get to the number of his name, hopefully tonight. This may be a little long class, but so the second beast describes Rabbi Akiva, the false prophet of Bar Kokhba, but it also largely describes the influence of rabbinical Judaism until this present time. It was the beginning of Kabbalistic rabbinical Judaism. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the land. It had 2 horns like a lamb, had authority, but it spoke like a dragon. Now, Rabbi Akiva was not a Jew. He was a convert to Judaism. He married a Jewish woman who gave him the opportunity to convert and to study to become a rabbi, and he became the first and greatest rabbi of Kabbalistic rabbinical Judaism. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it made the land and all its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Now, this is a little difficult to apply, but in mystical Kabbalah, what they call practical Kabbalah, which is nothing more than sorcery, magic, there is a type of curse that is called calling down the divine lash of fire. And it's where a curse is placed on someone so that their sins may not be forgiven or that they might die very shortly. And this may be the false sign that Akiva offered. And I haven't found historically where this is documented, but I suspect that it's talking about the practice of being able to curse people and they die. And he'd do that publicly, and when people died, people would assume he did possess the power he claimed to have. Of course, we know that to be a false sign. It's false in a lot of ways. First of all, Christians don't curse people. And we certainly don't wish them to die or for their sins not to be forgiven. In fact, we take every opportunity, don't we, to forgive those sins. And then we ask to be forgiven as we have forgiven others. So, causing fire to come down from heaven and on the earth in full view of the people. You remember, this is apocalyptic language. And the fire from the mouths of the 2 witnesses, earlier in Revelation, we learned that that's the law of God, not a literal fire from their mouths. Because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth, or of the land of Judah. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The image of the beast of secular Zionism was Bar Kokhba himself. And the second beast was given power to give breath to that image, to give it legitimacy, to put it forward in front, and to introduce it to the people breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads. Now, mark in the forehead is a spiritual mark of assent and giving over your will and your efforts to what it is that's asking for it. Bar Kokhba demanded a literal mark in the right hand in the form of a finger cut off to show allegiance to him. The rabbis of Judah largely objected, but that didn't matter. Everybody had to take that mark or be killed. And it says so that they could mark on their right hands or their foreheads so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now, Bar Kokhba issued currency, and on that currency it had a star that represented him as the son of the star. It was a messianic reference, and anyone that used that money largely declared that they accepted him as that Messiah. It's interesting because a lot of those coins are found all over Israel these days, in modern Israel, in archaeological digs, and many of them have that star rubbed off. You think people began to object to that star as a symbol of his messiahship? Would Christians attempt to erase that mark in order to buy or sell? It wasn't that easy for them because they didn't have a finger missing. But still, it's interesting that star gets rubbed off so often, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. And this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. It can also be translated as the number of mankind, and that number is 666. Now, there's a practice in Kabbalah called gematria, where letters are also given numerical values, and mystical, magical things are done with those numbers. Things that lead to some very, very evil and wrong conclusions. The gematria for Shimon Bar Kokhba is 666. And people make much of that. Many antichrists through history have had a gematria in one language or another, in one alphabet or another. This one is in Greek because the Revelation is written in Greek. And people kind of play around with Nero's name to make his name fit in Greek and in Hebrew. It's not talking about Nero. It's talking about Shimon Bar Kokhba, son of the star, 666. Now, it's interesting that some of the manuscripts say 616 instead of 666. Well, Simon bin Kozaba, son of the lie, the gematria for that is 616. Now, I can just see some Christian scribe saying, I'm not going to write down 666. He wasn't the son of a star. I'm going to write 616 because he was son of a lie. It's interesting that the minority of the ancient text, a few of the fragments, actually use the Greek designation for 666. Now, in the saga of Bar Kokhba, we go to the Lamb and the 144,000 in the 14th chapter. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. They had his name, the name of the Lamb, and the name of his father written on their forehead, and which is the same name, Yod-He, Vav-He, the Tetragrammaton. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. And the sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgin. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And they were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. These are those who were martyred in this period of time, starting with Stephen and going through the rebellion that brings this desolation. They were virgins. They didn't participate in the idolatry of the substitution of their Messiah with a false one. They didn't indulge in that idolatry. And sexual immorality in the Bible is often used as a metaphor for spiritual adultery or idolatry. And that's what it's talking about here in apocalyptic language. So these are those who did not follow that false Messiah and were the first fruits of the souls under the altars gleaned during this period of time. 6th verse, then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. And he said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. A second angel followed and said, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. And we can find 30 examples in the Old Testament prophets where Jerusalem and Judah are referred to as Babylon. And we'll see Mystery Babylon reemerge in the 17th chapter. Interesting. That'll be a good lesson. Which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries or her idolatries. A third angel followed him and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured out full strength into the cup of his wrath. They'll be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest, night or day, for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. Remember, these are the end times that Daniel spoke of and that came about in 135 AD. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. Can you imagine these days as a Christian? We're facing some tough days, and this may be a paradigm for which our future days follow. We will see. And I heard a voice from heaven say, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. And now here we see the fulfillment of what the angels told those who were present at the ascension. He's going up in the clouds. He's coming back the same way. Speaking of the deity coming in the clouds in judgment, as we saw the Son of Man come in the clouds in Daniel 7 in judgment, speaking of these same events, John uses similar language. It says, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man. Same language as from Daniel. With a crown of gold, this time with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, or the land of Judah, and the land was harvested. And this, I think, designates the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, followed closely on the heel by another harvest, being the fall of Betar in the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135. 17, another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grape from the earth's vine or from the land's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. And they were trampled in the winepress outside the city. Betar was outside the city of Jerusalem, the ruins of the city of Jerusalem. And the blood flowed out of the press. So this is obviously a metaphor that's made very, very clear in John's vision. And blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, and for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Now, we read last week and made reference one rabbinical account of blood flowing to the horse's nostrils, which is the same level as bridle. And there are 5 or 6 others in both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud. And it says, rising as high as the horse's bridles and for a distance of 1,600 stadia. After the fall of Betar, where the blood flowed to the horse's bridle, the bloodshed continued for another 7 years. And it drenched the land end to end. And end to end, it measures 1,600 stadia. What an amazing prophecy. Zechariah speaking of the same events that Daniel 7 is speaking of. They're speaking of the same events that Jesus prophesied and that John's vision foretold. It's an extremely significant set of events in the history of Judah. It's one that we don't learn about a lot, and therefore we tend to interpret these passages of Scripture very wrongly. But it's very clear in the language, it's very clear in the history of those events that that's what's foretold. And the land of Judah remained desolate of the influence of Judah for 2,000 years. And now we see that influence return. And we'll see it described in the 17th chapter of Revelation. And I'm going to leave that to you, Pastor. Been a long class. I hope you found it interesting. You can submit questions in the comment section. Till next time.